I would like to introduce our next presenter, though she and her assistant may be familiar to some of you. Leah Biel is a Brooklyn-based private collector who splits her professional time between the networks of NBC and the Brooklyn Public Library. She's vacationed in record stores all over the United States, Canada, and Europe. A second-generation RSC member and former secretary of the organization, she was also the first student member of RSC. And longtime members may have seen her behind a camera at conferences recording presentations along with her father, Michael. And today he's assisting her from his remote location in Kentucky as she presents RCA's TV Record Hop Mystery.
A note to the viewer, if possible, please make sure you use the pull bar so you see the screen with the slides and my camera at the same time. I'll be holding some things up and you're not going to want to miss them. This story starts where many of the best adventures start, the bargain bin at a record store. While in Portland, Oregon, following the 2019 ARS conference, remember actually going to conferences in person? In a shop called Everyday Music, I came across what appeared to be just an average compilation of unknown mid-1950s songs by artists only remembered by their families and high school teachers. Even at the bargain price of 50 cents, I would probably have just passed it by in this lousy condition, but the details on the cover stopped me in my tracks. It was called TV Record Hop. On the LP's cover, framed by the grooves of a record and escorted by some teeny boppers in caricature, was Dale Young of WJBK-TV, Detroit, Michigan. My mind immediately began asking questions. What was this album with a Michigan host doing so far out west in Portland? This was in the regular popular series on RCA Victor, LPM 1810, not a promo in RCA special products. My father said he'd never seen it, so that clinched it. I'd buy it without even knowing if the record was any good. The back cover seems to be promoting this Detroit DJ. Hey there, all you TV Record Hop fans. We've recorded this album especially for your dancing and listening pleasure. This is an exciting bunch of tunes with a beat, running or dancing from the cha-cha-cha to the stroll, including the big band sound with a driving beat. Your DJ pictured on the cover is Dale Young of WJBK-TV in Detroit, Michigan. You know Dale, for he is one of the most familiar figures in your area, spinning platters and introducing you, through video, to the artists that make them. He's a guy with a lot of responsibilities, too, interested in the younger set and anxious to please many different musical tastes and ideas. You can help Dale with his programming by dropping him a line at the station. Let him know the type of music you like best, the artist you want to hear, and how you like the show. RCA Victor salutes Dale Young of WJBK-TV in Detroit, Michigan. There were no clues that there were other albums promoting other DJs, so we set out looking for LPM 1810 in the catalogs. But this 1958 album is not listed in the RCA Victor catalog, nor in the Monthly Schwann, nor the Long Players Jazz and Pops. But there was an LPM 1800 with the same title in several of these monthlies. What was strangest was when consulting the annual dealers' numerical lists of the period, LPM 1800 only appears in the October 1958 numerical catalog, following Vaughn Monroe's LPM 1799, but then there's a gap to Tony Perkins' LPM 1853. Dale Young's LPM 1810 is not shown. When consulting the April 1st, 1959 numerical catalog, LPM 1800 is now gone, and there's a gap jumping from LPM 1799 to Larry Ferrari's LPM 1850. So much for contemporary print sources. When I started looking for Dale Young's LPM 1810 on the internet, I found out pretty quickly that there were quite a few other versions of this album for DJs on television stations dotted all over the United States, filling in part of the numerical gap. Specifically, I was able to find 16 different covers, starting with LPM 1800 as a generic national issue with a photograph of some dancing teens in the center of the record instead of a DJ. Because there's no specific DJ for this generic album, the copy on the back of this one reads a little differently. The kids pictured on the cover are dancing to the records of their favorite disc jockey. Your disc jockey is one of the most familiar figures in your area, spinning platters and introducing you, through video, to the artists that make them. He's a guy with a lot of responsibilities, too. Interested in the younger set and anxious to please many different tastes and ideas. You can help him with his programming by dropping him a line at the station. Let him know the type of music you like best, the artists you want to hear, and how you like the show. RCA Victor salutes the disc jockeys of America. These are the albums that were dedicated to a specific DJ and station, but were never listed in any catalog. LPM 1801, Harry Zimmerman, KSTP St. Paul. 1802, Milt Grant, WTTG, Washington. 1803, Bill Race, KCRA, Sacramento. 1804, Al Radka, KFRE, Fresno. 1805, Buddy Dean, WJZ, Baltimore. 1806, Herb Sheldon, WABD, New York. 1807, Nick Reyes, KFDA, Amarillo. 1808, Tom Malarkey, WBAP, Fort Worth. 1809, Ron Drake, WHP, Harrisburg. 1810, Dale Young, WJBK, Detroit. Yeah, you know him. 1811, Roy Lamont, WRVA, Richmond. 1812, Rudy Tellez, KTSM, El Paso. 1813, Ted Randall, KPIX. 1814, Wink, next one, Martin, Dale. Yeah, that one. WHBQ, Memphis. 1815, Jim Dunbar, WDSU, New Orleans. But none of the local issues were in any catalog. We've not been able to find any ads for the series in the trade press, and RCA Victor appears not to have promoted this unique concept in a press release that the trade press would copy. How were dealers or potential buyers supposed to know these were available? While there is a possibility that they were listed in Phonolog or OneSpot, COVID has kept us from finding any. However, they usually seem to be based on the dealer's numerical lists, and for current collectors, short of an internet search, these would now seem to have never existed. So we visited the vault of the current owners of RCA Victor, Sony, to see what answers lay there. The first surprise was that there was no file of the weekly release sheets, and that they didn't even have a full set of the albums in the New York City archives. The pile they brought up to us seemed a bit light. We had documented through LPM 1815, but their set ended at LPM 1813 and was also missing LPM 1805 and LPM 1807. And it didn't answer if there were any after LPM 1815. And what about the next 35 numbers to 1850? Ah, here's the answer, the famous blue release cards. All the albums from LPM 1800 through LPM 1815 were represented, and then they jumped from to LPM 1850. RCA Victor had set aside this block of 50 numbers, and they never went beyond this first set. This is confirmed on the backs of the recording sheets and the individual artist files. The clerks had laboriously handwritten the list of these 16 albums over and over and over again on the back of each artist's sheet represented on the album. The blue cards indicate the first 14 albums were released on June 20th, 1958 for the July popular release. But the final two, LPM 1814 and LPM 1815, were released August 22nd for the September 1958 popular release. Had there been some sales action that allowed for that second small release? But it becomes obvious that these weren't going anywhere. All of them were deleted April 1st, 1959, less than a year. They weren't in the catalog long enough to get beyond that one annual dealer's numerical. According to the blue cards, the rest of the block between 1816 through 1849 remained unassigned. Whatever plans they might have had seemed to have been scrapped. What we were able to see from the actual copies in the Sony archive and others we've been able to buy from dealers coast to coast, all copies were pressed in RCA's Indianapolis factory. RCA Victor had 3 pressing plants in Rockaway, New Jersey, Hollywood, California, and Indianapolis, Indiana. But even for cities, DJs in cities closer to the other plants, they still only pressed them in Indianapolis. Furthermore, all copies seen were pressed from the same lacquer master transfer. Side 1 is -1S, and side 2 is -3S. So as you can see, it was not a bestseller. But what did the few buyers actually hear on this album? The twins, Jim and John, Billy Muir's Rockin' Guitars, Ellie Gay, the Ecuadors, Leroy Kirkland's High Flyers, Ronnie, and the Rockin' Kings. All these artists and songs seem to be completely unconnected with each other, but as I was to learn, appearances can be deceiving. Were any of these performers ever successful? You can be excused if you don't recognize any of the performers. None of RCA's big names like Elvis Presley, Harry Belafonte, Perry Como, or even Janis Martin appear. They were all controlled by RCA's major producers like Steve Scholes and Brad McEwen. This was a production of the now forgotten Ed Heller, who ran a teen talent school out of his Long Island home and discovered his artists in a Hicksville, Long Island record store, Tarkoff's Music, owned by Danny Tarkoff. Undoubtedly, the most well-known artist on this album just so happens to be the only female artist on here, Ellie Gay. If you don't recognize her by that name, perhaps you're more familiar with her real name, Ellie Greenwich. In the following decade, she would go on to write some of the 1960s most enduring songs. But while in high school, she changed her performing name because she had feared teenagers wouldn't know whether to pronounce the W in her name. The blue release cards show her writing credit was mistakenly changed for the single, but her writing credit is actually Greenwich on the LP labels.
Saturday night, oh, ooh, what a night. While we rock and roll, he holds me close and he says to me, cha-cha-cha, you're my cha-cha-charming baby, cha-cha-cha-charming. I kiss him, wow, it's cha-cha-cha-charming, he'll kiss me, wow. Cha-cha-cha.
Just as our adventure started at a record store, so did Ellie's, and 17-year-old Jim and John Cunningham. Known as the Twins or the Twin Tones, they were also discovered by Danny Tarkoff and Ed Heller at Tarkoff's Music. Heller was so struck by their good looks that he inquired if they had voices to match. Both played piano and were in the high school band, with Jim on trombone and John on guitar. 1958 was a turning point in the record business. Teenagers were becoming heavy buyers of records, and the 45 single dominated. The 78 was about to breathe its last, and stereo discs were being introduced. The 12-inch LP had replaced the 10-inch LP, and Ed Heller, who was in Victor's album department, had been assigned to spend part of his time on singles. However, instead he had some ideas on promoting the 45 extended play EP for the teen market. As a 12-inch LP, TV Record Hop was an expensive $3.98 list, and stereo, which this album was not issued in, would have raised the price to $4.98. The 10-inch LP would have been a more affordable $2.98, but it was no longer an option. In January 1957, RCA had dropped EP prices, and the $149 one-disc album was reduced to $1.29. Heller figured the renamed Economy Package EP would be an attractive sales item for teenagers compared to the 79-cent single. In the fall of 1957, the Twin Tones, backed by Leroy Kirkland's band, had a potential hit with Joanne, which Heller had RCA release in a 45 EP in December 1957 with 3 other songs of theirs. Influential DJ Alan Freed, who was promoting both the Twin Tones and Leroy Kirkland, was upset about the release as an EP. He tried unsuccessfully to force RCA to also release it as a single. Heller's stubborn insistence on the EP resulted in Roulette Records also bringing the same backing band into the studio with the Playmates and making a similar sounding cover and smearing their 45 single all over the place. The Twins had their revenge. While the Playmates might have stolen Joanne, the Twins recorded a follow-up for this album and a single, Joanne's Sister.
She looks like her, she talks like her, and believe it or not, she walks like her, and deep inside I know she'll never break my heart.
Hedging his bets on DJ play, Heller had 6 of the tracks on TV Record Hop released as 3 45 singles, and the other 6 tracks were spread onto 4 45 EPs with other tracks. Many collectors look upon the EP only as alternate issues of LPs. Most of the time, the 4-track EPs duplicated LP releases using multiple discs. However, Heller wanted to make the EP packages unique. While some tracks would appear on both LPs and EPs, some tracks would only appear on the EP, and the cover pictures would differ. This practice proved annoying to customers and frankly is infuriating to us collectors and discographers. While all the tracks on TV Record Hop did appear on 45 singles or EPs, there is no TV Record Hop EP. A European EP from the 1980s that borrowed the cover graphics has no actual relationship to the RCA Victor LP, even though it calls itself Volume 2. To our post-1958 ears, there is one track which really stands out because of the bass singer's pre-echoing of the Marcel's 1961 recording of Blue Moon. To our mind, the Ecuador's Stay a Little Longer should have been a hit, but it wasn't because it wasn't released as a single. It was side 2, cut 2 of an EP. Just as Jim Cunningham said about DJ Alan Freed wanting Joanne released as a single instead of on an EP, Al Turner of the Ecuadors said, DJs didn't like playing the Ecuador's EP because they couldn't just throw it on a turntable and forget about it. If they played the first song on a side, they had to remember to stop the turntable before the second song started. If they played the second song, they had to cue it up somewhere in the middle of the record, not at the edge.
Boom, boom, de bop, de boom, boom, num, 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 num. Stay the longest, 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 stay the longest. Stay, stay, de bop, de boom, boom, num, 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 num. Num, num, num.
If I can have a little more time, maybe I can make you mine.
De bop, de boom, de bop, de boom, de bop, de boom, boom, num, 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 num.
Please, steady, steady, steady longer, honey.
The secret behind this album can only be discovered in the session sheets. While Leroy Kirkland is credited for the tracks in Crater Gator and The Stroll as himself, it turns out he did a lot more. In the session sheets, he's listed as the leader for the TV Record Hop album cuts of The Twins, The Ecuadors, and Ellie Gay, 8 of the 12 tracks. Additionally, Kirkland is given co-writer credit for album tracks by the Ecuadors, the Twins, and his own Leroy Kirkland's High Flyers. While he didn't have writing credit on the Ellie Gay album tracks, since she wrote those herself, Kirkland was listed as co-writer for 2 unreleased songs. Although barely remembered, Leroy Kirkland was featured by Alan Freed at concerts and led the orchestra on Screamin' Jay Hawkins' famous 1956 OK recording of Ice Put a Spell on You. Kirkland's EP tracks differ from the LP. The Stroll was released with the band name changed from the High Flyers to the Rockchaws on an EP called Stroll and the Cha-Cha-Cha. His other album track, Crater Gator, had been credited on the album label to Al Kelly with Leroy Kirkland's High Flyers. Now, if you're a person of a certain age, admittedly probably more around my father's age than my own, your ears may have picked up at the name Al Kelly. I'll answer your question. Yes, it is the famous double talker from stage and television. But Al Kelly is not heard on the LP. Instead, he and Crater Gator appear on EPA 4192, Rock and Roll from Outer Space. On a side note, this EP also lists another notable comedy name from the mid-20th century, Dickie Goodman, listed here as Dick Goodman.
I am here to clear out the stride main in your amplifiers and down the light your dull needle. In other words, make your hi-fi loud with speed and your lo-fi stray with a habit drop.
Crazy, man, crazy.
Going through RCA's files, we also discovered something that wasn't quite apparent anywhere else. The 3 singles were not only 45s, they were also issued on 78s. The 47 dash numbers were 45s, and the 20 dash numbers were 78s. Keep in mind, this is 1958 we're talking about. If you really wanted to be a completist on this album, you would have had to find the titles on all 3 speeds. As it is, I'm not completely sure how far off the ground these 78 versions got. And although I don't doubt their existence, I have so far been unable to find any of these 78s. The closest I've come is a picture of the New Zealand 78 of Joanne, which had not even been released as a single in the US. On the back of the blue release cards, they only provided the lower half of white samples of the labels. These particular cards were not located at the very end of the 20- series, but they were quite close to being there. The end was clearly in sight for Victor's 78 releases. About 40 numbers later, 20-7291 seems to be the last. And this is an example where the glue is dried up and the label for the 45 disappeared, leaving behind the historic last 78 label. The blue release cards indicate all the TV record hop singles. 45s and 78s were deleted on January 1st, 1959, 4 full months before the album itself was deleted on April 1st, 1959. Out of that entire block of 50 LPM numbers that were set aside, just 16 were actually used. I don't know if there were other TV record hop hosts that have been considered for their own version, or perhaps a follow-up series, but if there were, no information seems to survive in the Victor archives. By the way, I never found out how Detroit's own Dale Young made his way to Portland, Oregon. However it happened, the owner must have appreciated his copy enough to protect it with duct tape. Because if you can't fix it, duck it. And although he's not on the LP, as L. Kelly says on the EP,
If you dig the record, visit your local space station. Oswald. So long.
thank you.
Thanks, Leah and Mike, for that great, Leah for that great detective work, and Mike for your assist.
We're a team.
And just wanted to bring in something from the chat, a sort of typical ARSC confluence. That Steve Ram actually hosted the Twins at a record hop in 1961. And he has a photo if you want.
You don't say. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Steve, you would. Steve would, right, Dad? Steve totally would.
Yeah, some of our new members, this is the sort of relatively typical, like I said, confluence of incidents that show up often. And I had a question. Yellow Dog Blues seemed to be quite the outlier on that album. A W.C. Handy tune.
That was actually the didn't get to this is the other EP of, I have 3 of the 4 EPs and only one of the 3 45s, but this is one of the 3 that I have, the Billy Muir, that has both Yellow Dog Blues and Dancero on it. Yeah, it's a strange album. It grows on you.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's an album that grows on you. You know, you start off thinking, okay, you're just gonna see this. All right, this is curious, and for 50 cents, see, like I said, this is what happens at ARSC. I wouldn't have been in Portland if it hadn't been for ARSC, and I wouldn't have been at this record store if it hadn't been for ARSC. And this, but yeah.
Well, I was wondering. That so many of these local TV hop programs were so focused on local acts. Do you have a sense that maybe this was some sort of attempt to promote these acts? Do you think it was really unrelated to any of these local hops?
One of the things we were trying to figure out what was the purpose? Did they give them away to teeny boppers who were dancing on the sets at the station? Were they giveaways? Were they prizes? Were local record stores stocking them? We tried to contact one of the people on this cover, but we never heard back, and we were asking him, these exact questions, but we didn't get any answers in time. We're hoping that he'll get back to us, but no, that's still an open question.
Now remember, this is the year before payola, before the payola scandal. So that would have been something that could possibly have been a problem if RCA Victor really was involved in producing and promoting these performers locally. I would think that they would have sent them around the country, but we only know that Ellie Gay went around the country, but that was a couple of years later. She toured with George Goebel. Leah, you want to?
And actually, the touring she did with Goebel was regional, and it's in a book. They talk about they mention, I think the book Who Put the Bonk talks about her experience with Mr. Goebel on stage. That's all. It's strictly professional.
I found those 78s fascinating because by 58, those 78s were mostly going to some international audiences. And you mentioned a New Zealand copy, and I'm wondering about sort of the international attempt to market this, or at least it sort of being out there. Did you have any more information on sort of the direction of those 78s? Find them anywhere else?
No, I mean, I'm looking. I've
They were
been
hoping
looking.
to find it relevant.
Yeah, I've been looking on Discogs, and not all of them, but some of them are listed, but there's no picture. And unless like the saying goes, pics or it didn't happen. I want some sort of confirmation, not just a number. Show me a legit label. But toward that end, as you were talking about international, there were some things that we were seeing in that back part of the blue cards that were Canadian, that were strictly Canadian release. Right, Dad?
Yeah, the one before the last was a Canadian, especially for Canada. And the one before that is Harry Belafonte. Those were the last 378s.
And that's something you're not going to see, right? Unless you look at the cards.
Indeed. So thanks so much for a truly fascinating presentation and an example of discographic detective work.
Thank
This
you.
is another one I would suggest. Write this up for the journal. I'd love to read more about this.
We're planning on it. You heard it here first. We're planning on it. We just need to actually do it.
So look for that in the
longer version.
Everybody enjoy the rest of the conference, and find us online in the virtual lounge.
And I should mention any of these presenters you might try to catch in the virtual lounge if you have further questions or if something occurs to you later in the day, tomorrow, later in the conference. I know that a lot of people will be checking in. So I'd like to introduce our last presenter for the session. Greg McHale is the curator of the Northwestern University Music Library, overseeing all collections and services recorded in musical materials. Additionally, he holds an adjunct teaching appointment at Northwestern University's Vienna School of Music, Dominican University, and North Park University in Chicago. And Greg's main research interest is post-war musical experimentalism, in particular the music and writing of John Cage. The Northwestern University Library acquired the Glenn Branca archive in 2018, and the paper presented today on Neutral Records is a direct result of research conducted in that archive. So without further ado, Glenn Branca and Josh Bayer's Neutral Noise Finds a Home.
All right, thank you very much. Let me get my slides started here. So hopefully, guys, you can see this. Is that showing?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. Yes, this is really a research born out of my work with this collection, which has been an enjoyable ride, that's for sure. So music scenes are everywhere. Most of us take note of them when an artist gains enough popularity to foster the question, where did they come from? Or who else sounds like that? Or what music are they listening to? Our own interest drives the investigation. Scenes may be entirely invented, however, and there's a Heisenbergian quality at play. The act of observing a scene may be the action that creates it in the first place, or as we will see, maybe kills it. Some communities resist the very notion that scenes exist, and simply showing up somewhere does not make a scene. Will Straw, in his 1991 paper, Systems of Articulation, Logics of Change, Communities and Scenes in Popular Music, states, a musical scene is that cultural space in which a range of musical practices coexist, interacting with each other within a variety of processes of differentiation. For clarity, we may think of musical practices as often including not only a mix of talent and technique, but also roles like performer, audience, curator, promoter, and capitalist. Scenes are the people, places, ideas, expressions, and outputs of a local community. Many scenes remain local, forming shape and size, and ultimately dissolve without much identity as a scene, and some become translocal. The ideas and outputs of a translocal scene then become an incubator of cultural significance. From a small, derelict urban landscape emerged a music and art scene that has made a lasting impact. Giving rise to a kind of alternative music called noise rock, the scene in Lower Manhattan in the late 1970s was an active experimental artist hatchery. One artist, Glenn Branca, assumed nearly every role imaginable within the music scene, and today, for many, is only remembered as a footnote in the story of the rise of noise rock and its defining bands, Sonic Youth and Swans. This paper argues he was important to the music of Lower Manhattan as a translocal influence. Much of my research, like I stated, is informed by my work as the curator of the Glenn Branca Archive here at Northwestern, which we acquired shortly after his passing in 2018. All right. Oh, I see. Here we are. Now it started. On June 13th, 1977, New York City went dark. A massive blackout took hold of the city, and for 2 days, putting millions of residents and workers on a forced break. The mid-70s were hard on New York. An $11 billion debt gave the city little opportunity to borrow needed funds to set right a financial tailspin. As musician, actor, and New York City scenester Lydia Lunch reported, New York City in the 1970s was a beautiful, ravaged slag, impoverished and neglected after suffering from decades of abuse and battery. The famous CBGB's Music Club and a few other music venues and galleries hosted a vibrant music and art community bursting forth from the ravaged slag of the Lower East Side. The scene consisted of musicians, visual artists, filmmakers, and performance artists, and each participant in the scene could assume any of these roles. The do-it-yourself and highly collaborative approach was enabled by low rents on large spaces that served as homes, studios, and performance spaces. Many former denizens of the Lower East Side recall living in a high-crime, dilapidated area, but also one that seemed ready to realize any and all artistic visions. Quoting Lydia once again, everyone was doing everything. You painted, you were in a band, you made films, you wrote songs. It was all just so interconnected. We were all friends and freak by nature outsider artists. A 28-year-old playwright and director named Glenn Branca moved to New York City in 1976, but he quickly moved his artistic endeavors from theater to music. Compared to working with hired musicians, Branca found it much easier to create and perform original music for his plays and productions. And eventually his interest in music overtook his interest in theater. Clubs like CBGB's provided the stage needed for Branca and like-minded musicians, and the scene grew to include many bands. A common pool of players created interchangeable lineups. The guitar player in one band was the singer in another and the drummer in a third. The desire to participate was all that mattered, and musical talent was not a prerequisite. The scene found the moniker No Wave. There is uncertainty on the origination of the name itself, but the participants liked the suggestion that the music was not part of anything. Rather proudly, No Wave music claims a connection to nothing and aspires to nothing. It's a self-proclaimed break from the past, making no desire to build on or progress anything. At the height of No Wave in the mid-1970s, Branca fronted two bands, the Static and Theoretical Girls. Along with bands DNA, Mars, Teenage Jesus, and the Jerks, to name but a few, Branca and his bands became staples of the club scene. Arriving to this churning musical culture on extended visit in 1978 with Brian Eno. The composer, performer, and music producer was primarily in New York to help master a new record by the Talking Heads. And Eno was attracted to the quote-unquote plurality of cultures, which he saw as distinct from art scenes in the United Kingdom, and he convinced Island Records to record an anthology to document no-wave bands. Never assuming the resulting album would be commercially viable, Eno did feel a need to record the bands as a matter of historical importance. The resulting LP is titled No New York, released on Island in 1978 on the Antilles label. Eno chose only 4 bands, each with a very distinctive style. Not much about the album was pleasing to the artist and scenesters. James Chance of the Contortions said in an interview, as soon as Eno recorded that album, it killed something. No New York documents nothing. Whether Eno's record killed no wave, the scene was essentially over by the late 1970s, and most of the bands folded or evolved to new styles. However, Eno's record is not the only artifact of no wave music. A few small independent labels released 7-inch singles and a few LPs. Notably were the labels Lust on Lust, ZE, and 99 Records. Roar, a label owned by club owner Neil Cooper, produced a large cassette series hoping to capitalize on the brand new Sony Walkman. And you can see in this slide, this is the display ad that he published frequently to promote and sell his cassettes. As Branca's bands disintegrated, he began to write works for guitar ensembles, music much better suited for art galleries and concert halls. Still, he used rock elements such as distortion, high volume, and a driving beat. Branca himself had recorded a few 7-inch singles with his no-wave bands, but around 1980 found an interest in recording and promoting the music of others. Along with musician and visual artist Barbara S. and gallery operator Josh Baer, the three created the Just Another Asshole #5 audio anthology. At the time, Baer was the director of an experimental artist space called White Columns in the Tribeca neighborhood. Earlier that year, which would be June in 1981, White Columns was host to a 9-day music festival called Noise Fest. The bands were selected by Thurston Moore, who at around that time founded Sonic Youth along with Kim Gordon and a few other musicians working in the wake of post-No Wave. As Moore and Gordon described it, since No Wave had been killed by Eno's record a few years earlier, Noise Fest brought together people who had previously not known each other but were acutely aware of No Wave music. Where No Wave sought a complete break from the past, this new crop of artists and musicians were building on what they understood to be a rich legacy. Noise Fest and the Just Another Asshole anthology together defined the musicians working at the time. Mars, DNA, and other No Wave bands were replaced with Y Pants, Sonic Youth, Jules Baptiste Red Decade, and more. Glenn Branca was still at the center of this mix and felt that he needed to take an active role in recording and promoting this music. According to rumor, Branca first approached 99 Records with the notion to record some of the Noise Fest bands, and in particular, Sonic Youth. Label owner Ed Ballman had released Branca's first record of concert music called Lesson Number 1, and the label had success with a few other bands on the scene. To Branca, 99 seemed like a good match. When Ballman declined, Branca talked to Josh Baer back at White Columns, and the two men founded Neutral Records. The first band to issue a recording was Sonic Youth. Now this slide shows you all of the recordings by Neutral in order from the upper left, which is the first one, down to the lower right, which was the last recording. Between 1982 and 1987, Neutral released 15 phonodisc records. The range of style suggests Branca and Baer were looking to record the scene rather than a sound. This quasi-ethnographic approach puts Neutral on common ground with Brian Eno. In addition to Sonic Youth, Neutral recorded other noise rock bands, Swans, which is down here on the lower left, and Rat R, which is right next to them. A young Eric Bogosian over here released 2 of his monologues on a record titled Live in London, and No Wave filmmakers Beth B. and Scott B. produced and released a soundtrack for their film Vortex. In an interview from 1983, Branca asserts his intent with the label is to get on record a kind of artistic expression that is not viable in the commercial world. He believed the music recorded on his label would appeal to many people. Without his efforts, he felt, they may never learn of it. Again, similar to Eno, Branca and Baer did not expect a high degree of commercial success, but rather felt the label was an important tool to document. All right, and here is a listing of the releases with a little bit more information for you. I'm sorry that previous slide, I could not manage to cram in the titles for those records, so I had to kind of split it up here. Several of the bands utilized a recording studio at Radio City Music Hall called Plaza Sound Studio. The building had fallen into disrepair, and in order to have a revenue stream, the old radio broadcast studio used by Toscanini and the NBC Radio Orchestra was converted for recording. Rates were cheap, and the room was accommodating simply by its size. Other studios utilized includes legendary Noise New York and DC studios. Presently, it's unclear how many units were produced. Small batches, certainly. The only verification I've been able to have is that Neutral 7 by Jack Goldstein, which is a multi-disc recording of musique concrète for use in a gallery installation, had only 50 units made. While it's not entirely clear how Branca and Baer delegated responsibility, it seems clear that the label artists were granted quite a bit of control. In fact, Branca said his single task at the label was to stamp everything for approval. And this appears to be true, and that the archive here at Northwestern consists of correspondence from Baer to Branca telling him to give his approval on a wide range of matters. Since both men were active in the scene that produced the artists they recorded, it's fair to say that artist and repertoire decisions, such as they were, came to conclusion in a collaborative manner. As a sampling of style, I'm going to play a few excerpts. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Sonic Youth, today considered a seminal noise rock band that is frequently mentioned as an inspiration for subsequent indie rock musicians. Swans is another band working within a similar sonic universe. Fronted by Michael Guerra, Swans drew more inspiration from earlier no-wave bands and the concert music of Branca, and their performances were and are notoriously loud. All right, moving on. Barbara S., again of Just Another Asshole fame, formed the band Y Pants with two other artists in the scene. Decidedly an outsider art concept, Y Pants commonly used toy instruments to create what she called small music. And the release on Neutral was not their first, as 99 had issued a previous EP, but this album, Beat It Down, was their first full-length album. Composer Michael Gordon is well known in new music circles. As a founding member of the Bang on a Can Festival, his music and advocacy for modern concert music is far-reaching. He formed the Michael Gordon Philharmonic in 1983, and in 1987 recorded 3 works released as Neutral 15, the last record made by the label. Gordon has since recorded for Nonesuch, Cantaloupe, and CRI. This is called Acid Rain. Example is Paul McMahon. Seemingly counter to the noise and art rock offerings of Swans and Y Pants, the first record by Paul McMahon is a compilation of quirky pop songs. McMahon, like so many other artists mentioned in this presentation, was a member in no-wave bands, a performance artist, and a visual artist. And for a time in the mid-70s, he worked at the Artist Space in New York City.
When I go to sleep at night, I roll myself up in a ball so tight. I close the window, shut the blinds, close my eyes, turn off my mind. I've got to concentrate. I've got to concentrate. I've got to make a wish. I've got to make my fate.
That's a catchy one. That's been in my head for weeks now. So across the 15 releases, I put my own categorization in the following manner: 1 spoken word comedy, 1 film soundtrack, 1 audio installation, 5 concert art music, and 7 alternative rock. But these terms are to be understood very broadly and entirely my imposition. The boundary between concert music and rock is particularly blurred and only important in the context of this demonstration. Bronca and Bear, in other words, may have made no style or performance-based distinctions. No Wave and the music following has been described as living in a borderland of rock and art music, and it's clear to see this reflected in Neutral's offerings. None of it likely to be successful from a sales standpoint, but to echo Bronca's intent, all of it possibly finding an audience. The label output is stylistically diverse, born out of the artist working in the scene and giving as much freedom as possible to the artists. According to Paul McMahon, Neutral was the label on the scene. Bronca and Bear were well known and they had established paths to producing a record. While very little financing was made available, Neutral did have the ability to book time in a few specific studios, engage producers, and offer distribution. It was the connective tissue that enabled artists to make inroads with parts of the recording industry that may have been inaccessible otherwise. Longtime music industry leader Peter Wright, presently chair of the board of the Archives of Contemporary Music, initially worked to distribute Neutral releases via independent services, including Important, Dutch East, Bonaparte, and New Music Distribution Service. David Rosenblum's Souls of Chaos asserts Neutral Records is distributed by Roar, but no other records indicate this. At least one catalog, which you can see here, created for sales and distribution was made, but again, as far as unit production, I don't really know how many units were made. Paul McMahon told me that they made only 500 of his records. On September 10th, 1988, Bronca and Bear sent a letter to Neutral artists stating their intent to end the label. They say the reasons are due to non-label activities, both Bronca and Bear, due to non-label activities of both Bronca and Bear and the inability to finance less commercial releases. The letter continues to say all royalty commitments will be upheld, remaining stock sold, all production material, master recordings, and original artwork will be returned to the artist, and all rights returned after 1 year. One last project was underway at the time of Neutral's closing. Composer Charlemagne Palestine recorded a series of solo piano works on a Bosendorfer 290 SE in April of 1988. These recordings were not released by Neutral, but in keeping with the promise of the closing letter, Palestine regained ownership of the recordings and was finally able to release them on CD 10 years later on the Dutch label Baroni. The final act of the label is a continuation of the artist-centered approach. Rather than seek a buyer for the label assets, Bronca and Bear reverted all holdings back to the artist. This is a confirmation and indication of the stated intent to document a scene in all its diversity for the sake of the artist and possible audiences. So very quickly, I know I'm running out of time here. This slide just shows which releases by Neutral were found life afterward through commercial reissue, or which of the artists have loaded some of their material onto their own supported websites. As you can see, about half of it has been reissued. There's still quite a bit that you can find on eBay or other sites like that, but otherwise it doesn't live really anywhere else. All right, in closing here, The strength of the small neutral catalog lies in the fact that both Glenn and Josh had enjoyed strong roles in the no wave scene, and before embarking on creating a label, or let me restate that, they enjoyed strong roles in the no wave scene before embarking on creating a label. As they gained expertise, the do-it-yourself approach evolved to a professionalism that enabled a high-quality product. They kept a focus on the artist with small rewards for the label itself, and in doing so, the two men kept a secure place for neutral as part of the scene. They were not out-of-towners. They did not line their pockets with the labor of the artist. They controlled the label assets only so far as to help find an audience. When it was over, they gave everything back. The 15 releases allow a close look at the avant-garde as it was being expressed in Lower Manhattan at the time. Finally, as a launching pad for Sonic Youth, Swans, and other noise rock, Neutral should be remembered in particular for finding the audience, and separately, Glenn Branca as an artist can be remembered for establishing the noise rock sound. While Branca was not the only musician working with rock idioms in a concert setting, he found the audience and brought more than just his music to the world. As a final tribute to Branca's impact, Thurston Moore's 2019 Spirit Council includes a 30-minute tribute to Branca called 8 Spring Street. It's clear that Branca's ideas are still generating new modes of expression, not just with his own music, but in the elevation of music around him. And that is my presentation.
Thanks, Greg. Lot of love for particularly Y Pants in the chat, but also Neutral in general. A lot of comments. Love this. And I have a couple questions from our conference manager, program chair, Terry Brennegar. She wanted to know how popular these records were. Did they sell? Or were there sort of a lot left over after the label collapsed?
Yeah, well, I haven't been able to find any specific information about sales, but Peter Wright did confirm that they did have a distribution plan in place. And I'm not sure how beyond New York those records really became, but certainly Sonic Youth and Swans were picked up, and some other bands like that. But I have a feeling it didn't really sell very well. And you know, in Branca and Bear's last letter saying they essentially don't have the finances to continue, maybe that confirms that.
And that was sort of Terry's other question. Was this sort of very local to the New York area as far as the artists and the marketing? Yeah,
I know Branca toured extensively. So did Sonic Youth and Swans. Again, those were the ones that really kind of made it out. But I don't think a lot of other artists really continued on. Paul McMahon moved away from music, as did Barbara S. What else? I think Rat at Red R was another well-known noise rock band at the time, but they sort of fizzled out not too long after that as well. So I think a lot of the, it was very much a sort of time and place label. So I think a lot of the artists sort of dispersed and moved on to other things in a very similar way to the way no wave kind of evolved and kind of dispersed very quickly.
And I was actually interested in those no wave cassettes. I was wondering sort of the venue for that ad, you know, where was that placed, sort of in zines or newspapers?
Right. The owner of that label, who I think I'm going to have to go back here just to remind myself, he had been working as in the music industry for a long time, and had a lot of paths for distribution. So if I can find his name here, he owned a club in New York City, and that was the basis for that particular label. He talked the bands into allowing him to make recordings, and I'm not sure what kind of deals he made or did not make with the actual labels that owned those recordings, but he produced him themselves and sold them through zines and magazines and that kind of thing. Roar is still around. It really kind of grew into a much larger label that encompasses not only this kind of early, 80s New York-based rock, but it's become much more of a important label for alternative rock music in particular, and hip hop too.
I was also curious about the sort of the collapsing, Brian Eno recorded them and he killed no wave. Do you get the sense that it was because it was Brian Ebo, because of him, because it was sort of a major label release, or was it just the act of being recorded?
That's a great question. And what I've read from testimonies of so many of the musicians and artists at the time was they became pretty angry with Eno in the process. So he showed up and he was going to produce this record for the Talking Heads and was in New York and heard all these bands and was apparently blown away by the scene. And anecdotally, I guess he made a lot of promises to artists like, oh yeah, I'm going to record you. I'll record all of your stuff. It's going to be this great thing. And then ultimately he did a lot of gatekeeping on what was produced. And I think to an extent that maybe angered a lot of the people within the scene. But again, by the time he pushed that record out, a lot of the artists were already beginning to move in other directions anyway. So, it's the scene steers and musicians claim that it killed the scene. I don't know if it really did, but in the sense of maybe putting a label on it and angering the musicians around it, it may have contributed in some way. As I said in the beginning of this, the no wave artists and musicians really very purposefully wanted to be thought of as not being a part of anything else, not wanting to be building on something that was a real break from the past, and maybe having a major label and someone like Brian Eno that certainly could have contributed to this feeling that they were becoming part of something and they did not want to do that.
And one final question. Jeff Willens wants to know if Ike Yard was ever involved with Neutral Records.
What's the name?
Ike Yard.
That's not a name I have seen so far.
And another question of if this genre ever crossed over with the post-punk scene, especially in New York.
I guess I don't feel like I know enough about the post-punk scene in New York to know that, but I know Swans in particular is kind of thought of as seminal band leading to that as a genre. But I think certainly some of the Neutral releases, assuming they were around in New York through the 80s and maybe through the early 90s, would be part of that musical landscape that might help contribute to post-punk.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for a great session. For all of you, thank you for joining us. And I want to reiterate some of the statements that were made earlier this morning. If you'd like to get involved with ARSC, we have plenty of positions open for volunteers. Check the ARSC website for our call for volunteers. If you're not a member, lots of great benefits. I think you've seen some of those in this session, that a lot of people with a lot of diverse knowledge that are always happy for you to research and have you reach out to them. Look for everybody in the lounge and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thanks so much.